God's sake, why are you on the radio?
I've always loved radio. When I was a little kid, I built crystal radio. I mean, literally like 7 years old, my parents gave me a crystal radio kit, and I used to listen to a local radio station. I wanted to be a DJ. When I was 15 or 16, I got my first job as a DJ at a country western station in Michigan. I did that for on and off for a couple of years, different stations, different kinds of music. And then I did news for 7 years. And then I went into the business world for years. And Louise and I sold an advertising agency that we had in Atlanta in 1997, and retired to Vermont. And that was going to be the end of my working career. This was our fourth business that we had built up and sold, and we had some money set aside for retirement. And over the next couple of years, I wrote a couple of books. Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, I wrote my book on ADHD that did real well. But George W. Bush started trying to talk us into this war in Iraq. And I was flipped out about it. And the only radio talk shows that I could find anywhere, in fact, we drove home for Thanksgiving that year from Vermont to Michigan, and all the way there, all I could find was right-wing talk radio. And so I wrote this article for Common Dreams titled Talking Back to Talk Radio, in which I said, I understand the radio business. I used to be in the radio business. Half of America is Democratic, half of America is Republican. Why are only Republicans represented on the airwaves? And, and because the prevailing wisdom was that only conservatives wanted to listen to talk radio. That's what Rush Limbaugh kept telling everybody. And so a couple of venture capitalists in Chicago, Shelley and Anita Drobny, read that article, called me up, flew me into Chicago, and used my article as the business plan for Air America Radio. This kicked off Air America Radio. I helped start that. But I just, they were taking months and months. It took them 7-8 months to get this thing together. And I was impatient. I just wanted to I want proof of concept. I want to show that what I'm saying, that I'm not nuts here. And so I found a local radio station in Vermont that was willing to put me on the air on a Saturday morning. I said, let me try this out. And it worked. And I got picked up by a network that had 27 affiliates. It was IE America Radio. It was owned by the UAW out of Detroit. It's no longer exists. And for a couple of years, I was on IE America. And then, ultimately I ended up back on Air America, where I'd started, which I'd helped start. And then Air America died, and I just, kept on going. So it started out, something that I love, radio. My main goal was to be able to have a conversation that wasn't simply kissing George Bush's butt about invading Iraq. And here I am. It'll be 20 years in March of next year that I've been doing this show. And I'm having a good time. It's perfect for an ADHD adult like me because it constantly changes.
Until then, I just thought it was your son. I didn't know till this moment that you suffer from it too. But we use the term suffer. But my brother-in-law, who was a psychiatrist, and he said, I asked him years ago, why am I so anxious? He said, you were the guy in the cave that didn't run out in front of the saber-toothed tiger. You were the one that kind of stayed there. And just like you said about the chimpanzee story, I mean, so they died of various reasons, not depression. They died because the snake got them, or they died.
That's right. Yeah, they died because nobody was warning them of danger.
All it says to me is that we are critical to our survival.
I think that my particular neurology, my ADHD, which got me in, during the Eisenhower administration, when I went into second grade in 1956. That was when Sputnik went up, and maybe it was 57, and Eisenhower threw all this money at schools for gifted programs, and I was in this gifted program, and so I was never bored. I mean, by the time I was graduated from sixth grade at the age of 12, I had 2 years of Spanish, a year of Latin. I was doing trig. I was reading at a college level, but then I hit middle school, and I was insanely bored and constantly getting in trouble, to the point where, in 11th grade, I started a newspaper for my high school, an underground newspaper, and I published an article about the principal, and I got kicked out of school. I got a court order keeping me away from school. So I took a GED and went to Lansing Community College, and then I got arrested in the anti-war era and dropped out of college too. So ADHD was in some ways a curse for me. If I wanted to be a professor, it would have been a challenge, but it was also a blessing. I mean, it's defined my life.
Yeah.
So
one thing I have to ask you is, when you write your books as an ADHD person, I play music, I watch movies when I write. Do you need that external stimuli? Does that focus you, or are you a quiet when you write? Are you in a quiet environment?
I play music that has no words in it. If there's
Right,
words in the
Mozart or
music,
something,
yeah, mostly it's George Winston's piano music or
Oh,
John
sure.
Fahey guitar music.
But
Just
it's
kind of,
something. It's
yeah,
something which I find interesting.
yeah,
Because I tend to focus more when I have that exterior stimuli.
yeah, me too.
I've
A
never
lot
been.
of kids.
You said we live our lives based on the stories we tell ourselves, correct? A while back. Does that sound like Joseph Campbell to you a little bit? And if so, can you describe that a little bit more about how we live based on the stories we tell ourselves?
Yeah, well, yes, Joseph Campbell was, a meaningful inspiration to me at one point in my life, and his protege, Stephen Larson, who wrote the book Fire in the Mind, which was the authorized biography of Joseph Campbell, is one of my closest friends. And I've known Stephen for 30 or 40 years. And in fact, his wife just passed away. And so, that idea that at the individual level and at the cultural level, we transmit our values, our societal values. We transmit our identity, our sense of who we are and where we came from, principally through stories. And, we all know stories that we have in our culture that are meta to behavioral models. For example, the little boy who cried wolf, teaches us not to lie. The Emperor's New Clothes teaches us not to, BS people about, what's up. Again, not to lie, really. There's, 1,000 examples. And we tell ourselves stories about ourselves too, as well, through the process of growing up. These are, there's these big societal stories that define cultures and societies. There are national stories, our story of independence from the Brits and all that kind of thing. And then there are personal level stories, of who we are. And some people's personal stories are really pretty grim, they say to themselves that, they're the bad person or the unwanted person, or the unloved person or the unlovable person or whatever. And then there are other stories that are, or the broken person. And then there are other stories that can be very useful. And in fact, that was the basis of my attempt to reframe attention deficit hyperactive disorder back in the 90s when I wrote my first book on that. And it was published in 96, to say that, neurological differences across the spectrum, frankly. I mean, I haven't written much about anything other than ADHD, but I believe that this applies to the entire autism spectrum. And I'm increasingly thinking that ADHD is part of that. That, there are positives as well. And if we look at it in those frames, it literally changes not only our sense of self and self-worth, but our ability to be functional in the world.
I hear so much about being on the spectrum, which I think is still an evolving kind of thing in terms of what's inclusive. We have a friend whose son was, Asperger's. He's one of the smartest guys. They were bidding on his services to go to graduate school. And I've always thought about people being in a box. I think you referred to a speech about a box when you were in Norway. When you talk about the story, and I believe personally and unscientifically that we create our story very early and in that box. And for instance, my fears, my loves, or all my things are in that box. You know what I mean by the box? That
Sure.
I carry it with me throughout my life, and I don't know what to do with that box anymore because, my fear of flying or my fear of anything was ingrained in me early. Is there a way out of the box?
Yeah, I mean, really what you're defining in that metaphor of the box is our sense of self. Who I am, where I came from, what my purpose is, what my loves and fears and hates and desires are. To a certain extent, that is defined for us by temperament, which is a fascinating, entire different conversation. But I think temperament is vastly underrated as a variable in personality. Part of it is defined by our parents and how they raised us and what their expectations were for us and for themselves to a large extent, because parents tend to project onto their children their own struggles, right, and their own good stuff. And then also by our culture, and that's as small as the local neighborhood and the kids you grew up with, and as large as, you know, the Uber culture, the larger culture, the, you know, the movies we watch, the country we grow up in, the national mythologies, the stories of what humanity is and who we are. I mean, all the way back to, you know, in the Bible, Adam and Eve, and being told that man was given dominion over the earth, and literally taking that seriously and just deciding, hey, we can just destroy this thing because God gave it to us and we can just do whatever we want with it. You know, some of these stories are very, very useful. In fact, they're foundational to us. They keep us going. We fall back on them during times of crisis, and they motivate us. And others of these stories can be very dysfunctional. They can be destructive at a personal level and as a culture, and also at a cultural and societal level. I think one of the big areas where I play, where we see, or where I work, where we see these stories being writ large and really being the essence of everything is politics. Mm-hmm. Politics is really the science and practice of creating, employing, and sometimes swatting down stories.
Well, touching on politics, which I try to avoid desperately when I do these pieces, I have to believe that a sensitive creature has been, their brains have been vivisected in the last 6 years. I don't know how much more we can take. And do you think that these influences from the political landscape now have assaulted our faith in things, and maybe are doing irreparable damage to what we believed in, what America was? And I personally do, and I'm wondering what you think.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I grew up in a world that was pretty much entirely white, and I don't mean just the neighborhood around me. I mean, I only saw white people on television. I only saw white people in the movies. When I did see people who weren't white, they were portrayed as villains or buffoons or minstrels, and you know that shapes your worldview. You can't avoid that, and that has been changing over the last 20 years as the demographics of America have changed, in part because of changes in our immigration laws in 1965. From 1924 until 1965, we literally had a law in the books that said that we could not allow immigrants into the country outside the racial proportions of the country. So if the country was 80% white, 80% of the immigrants coming in had to be white. In 65, we changed that and went to this lottery system. And suddenly a lot of people of color started immigrating into the United States. And now there's a large backlash against that by white people who realize that in some states, like in Texas, you know, white people are no longer the absolute majority. And in the United States, in terms of, you know, if you look at people under 10 years old right now, white people are not the majority. And that's, of course, going to age into the general population within the next decade. And it's going to change our voting, and it's going to change our politics. And so there's this enormous backlash. And I think in the 70s, or really in the 60s, in the mid 60s, when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 64 and 65, he said to Bill Moyers, who was his press secretary, he said, "I believe that I may have just given the South away from the Democratic Party for a generation." He didn't know the half of it. He underestimated how much race drives politics. And so Richard Nixon came along in 68, wanted to be president. And he said, you know, let's pick up these white racists. We don't know how many are out there. We don't know what percentage of the white population is primarily driven by racial grievance or animus. But there's enough of them that they might help us around the margins win elections. And he rolled out this thing called the Southern Strategy. That has metastasized, I'd say, over the years, and now is one of the principal drivers in our politics, and it's become a left-right issue, which seems crazy to me. I don't know why conservatism would be racially conscious, if you're looking at the classic definitions of the kind of, Edmund Burke conservatism. But that's what's happened. And well, I guess that's
right.
enough.
That's just a wonderful way. I've never thought of. So Nixon invited the wolf into the henhouse, so to speak. I mean, he had no idea what he was unearthing. And the one thing I want you to comment on is, the last few years have been stressful, as I was apolitical until Act 10 was implemented in Wisconsin. My wife's a teacher. And then I started thinking, wow, this is starting to affect me directly. And I guess I said a metaphor was, you look under a rock and you find the maggots and you find the horrible things. I maintained it's always been there, but social media has lifted the rock, in terms of the animus and in terms of the disgusting views we have. And, we look at the South, or you look at the MAGA movement, and yeah, I'll say it's nauseating to me, but it's nothing new.
Yeah. Well, what Nixon did, I mean, the racists were always there, and there was always part of our politics. I mean, go back to Reconstruction, go back to the reaction to Brown v. Board, and things like that. Nixon just invited them because they used to be the Democratic Party. I mean, the racists used to be the Democrats, the Dixiecrats. Yeah. And, Lyndon Johnson blew them off. And so Nixon pulled them into the Republican Party, which had been hadn't been a racist party prior to the 60s. My father was a Dwight Eisenhower Republican and quite proud of it. And he was very much not a racist. But I think what really happened was over the last decade or two, largely since the Willie Horton ad in 1988, we've seen politicians, largely Republican, occasionally Democratic, using, shouting out to the white racists by way of saying, hey, come on over and vote for me. And increasingly, it's politicians who really their first goal is to dance to the tune of big corporations and billionaires who are doing this. There was another point I wanted to make. You kind of rolled a couple of questions into one there. What was the second part of your question?
I'm not really sure. Just terror and sheer wondering how all this, it's not really a question as much as an observation that I've been living with in terms of it always being there. And well, let me segue to something else since I completely forgot where I was. In terms of my wife's a teacher.
My apologies.
No. My wife's a teacher, and just briefly, half her class may suffer from ADHD. It's just so prevalent. It's probably in, the air or water. How can she address a larger body at one time? And I don't mean to put you on the spot with that, but I mean, is there a way a teacher, and I'm imagining that ADHD and worse is so common now that, we don't know why, or maybe we just never diagnosed it before. But do you have any suggestions as to how someone handles 10 people at a time or 20 people?
Yeah, I do.
27 students right now, and I guess 14 of them have some sort of ADHD.
Wow. Yeah, I'm not surprised, frankly, because the diagnoses are going up. Let's first define the frame here. My argument is that attention deficit hyperactive disorder, with the exception of really extreme cases, which I think are probably something different altogether, but that ADHD, it's known by a constellation of three primary symptoms: easily distracted, or easy distractibility, a desire for sensation seeking, and well, I'm blanking on the third one. It's been a long time since I've talked about it.
You and me both.
Yeah. In any case, the back in the day, the hunter gatherer who was easily bored, who was easly bored, would be the one who went out into the field looking for dinner. It was a survival instinct. Whereas when the agricultural revolution happened, the guy who could pick bugs off plants all day long, day after day after day, was ideally suited evolutionarily for survival. we imported into our schools the old factory model of, put the bolt on the nut, or the nut on the bolt all day long. And these kids don't work well within that factory model. These kids need the stimulation, they need the excitement, they need to be engaged, particularly when they're smart. It's particularly difficult with the really bright kids. And so I'll tell you a quick story. I was giving a speech in the late 90s on ADHD in Taiwan. I had heard that there was some just remarkable, innovative stuff going on in the Taiwanese public school system. And I don't speak Mandarin, so I didn't understand the content of what was happening in the class. But there was a teacher, she had about 30, 35 kids in her class. And she's up in front of the class, and she, for about 5 or 10 minutes, is explaining a concept on the board and talking, and it was only 5 or 10 minutes, just kind of laid that down. And then she looks around the class and she says, raise your hand if you understood what I just said. And 5 or 6 kids raised their hands. Now, this was something that they all understood because they do this frequently. 5 or 6 kids raised their hands. And so she said, great. Okay, so she had those 5 or 6 kids then stand up, and the kids around them, immediately around them, formed little circles around them. So now we've got 5 or 6 little circles in the classroom. And the kids who understood what she was teaching started teaching their own peers. And as the kids who were sitting in these circles came to understand the concept, they stood up and became part of the teachers.
Right.
Until every kid in the class was standing. Now you've got kids physically engaged. You've got peer-to-peer teaching, which will always beat teacher to child teaching. Kids would much rather talk to their friends than to the teacher. You've got the teacher, walking around making sure that the teacher kids are actually telling the right thing, or accurately conveying the information. And afterwards I talked with her and I said, do you have a problem with ADHD? And she said, we don't even understand that concept. I mean, it's not a problem in my classroom. Yeah, I do think that everybody has their own preferred sensory style. Some people, when you say goodbye to them, they'll say, see you later. Those are people who principally experience the world through vision, which is most of us, about 70% of us. Some people will say, I'll talk to you later. Talk to you later.
Interesting.
It's not an
accident. It's not an accident.
This is not an accident. This is the deep unconscious expressing the actual way you experience the world. And about 20% of people will say, I'll talk to you later, because those are people who principally live in an auditory world.
Yes.
And then you've got about 5% of people who will say, I'll catch you later, or I'll be in touch later. And those are people who experience the world through touch, through emotion, through sensation. Or in other words, they have a kinesthetic way of understanding the world. And those are the 3 principal systems that we employ to understand the world, to interact with the world around us. So the best teaching environments and the best communication environments really are ones that incorporate all 3, rather than just picking the one that's most common, which would be visual. You want to try to do all 3 in anything that you can do. And you also, if you're talking to a group of people, you want to sometimes use visual metaphors, like, now we can really see how this works, and auditory metaphors, and we can tell ourselves the story of how this works, and kinesthetic metaphors, and we get a good solid feeling and understanding that we can really get hold of to carry this information forward. So that would all be one sentence that would reach literally everyone in the audience. Whereas if you simply said, now we see what we're talking, now do you see what I'm talking about? You're only talking to 3/4 of the people. That's, I think, a really important concept. And I write about it in my book on succeeding with ADHD. I forget the title of that book, but because it got reissued with a new title last year, a couple of years ago.
I ordered it from the library. I'm waiting for it.
Yeah. There's one about I wrote one on adult ADHD, which is basically about how to be an entrepreneur. I wrote one, Hunter and a Farmer's World, which lays out my concept, and then I wrote one about being successful in the world with ADHD, and that's the one that has it has the tests in it and everything for audio, visual, kinesthetic. But the other thing I would add about depression, and I think this is absolutely fascinating. there was a study, and I've been looking for this for years. I heard this in the 70s on NPR, or on the local NPR station in East Lansing when I lived in East Lansing. It was on the MSU station. And I have not been able to find it since then, but I remember it quite vividly. Somebody had done a study with monkeys, because they found that, or chimpanzees specifically, and what they found was that the percentage of humans who experience episodic clinical depression, who are bipolar or who are prone to depressive episodes, is measurable. And it's a relatively small number. I don't remember the number now, but it's like somewhere between 5 and 15%. And it's the same for monkeys, or for chimpanzees. The same percentage of them exhibit depressive behavior on a regular basis. And so then the question becomes, why? Where did this come from? So what they did was they had this was like one of these wild environments where they could interact with these chimpanzees. And so what they did was they targeted the chimpanzees who were behaving like they were depressed. They hit them with tranquilizer darts and literally took them out. It didn't kill them, just removed them from their community. And the assumption of the scientists was that the entire community would just start partying. Hey, the bummer guys are gone. We can have a good time. All the people who are depressed. And what happened was that when the researchers, when they pulled the plug on the experiment a couple of months down the road, about half the monkey troop was dead. And what had happened was the depressive ones, the classic symptoms of depression, they were not sleeping well at night. They were hypervigilant. They were not socially engaged typically. So they would move to the periphery of the group. They would be awake half the night, and they were constantly on the alert and, for danger. And they were the community's early warning system. They were the ones who consistently spotted the boa constrictor or the leopard or the cheetah that was coming through the woods for the rest of, for the party animals, for everybody else. And you think about, people who, famous people in history who have really struggled with bipolar disorder or depression. Winston Churchill's probably the most well-known example. And I think he was the guy who was warning. He was the one waving the flag. Look out, take Hitler friggin' seriously.
Yeah. And wasn't he also the one that said, we're never giving up, in essence?
Yes.
He had that monomaniacal vision where he said, where no one else would, England would be like, it's over. I'm not trying to pretend I know a lot, but I do remember enough about him that he was monomaniacal, and when he knew he had to.
We will fight them on the beaches. We will fight them in the air. We will fight them in the cities. We will never give up, never give up, never give up. And he learned that from fighting with his own depression his whole entire life.
Okay. Happy Christmas or happy holidays or whatever the hell you say these days.
Yeah, for me, it's Christmas, whatever it is for you.
Merry Christmas, because it is for me too. But
Merry Christmas.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, brother.